Assalamu alaikum and peace be with you. This is Malik Mujahid. I'm an Imam in Chicago and you're watching Muslim Network TV. We're on Galaxy 19 satellite as well as Modern Fire TV, Roku, and our own channel on YouTube and MuslimNetwork.tv. MuslimNetwork.tv is live there as well. Today we'll be talking about something which is extremely critical for our country. While we are talking about racism, standing up against racism, today and yesterday, I'm thinking of the future of the Islam. But due to the Islam, we need to talk about the system of the criminal justice system and the police system. How we need to think in a broader sense. And in the broader sense, comes the issue of other reforms, like preparing for the future. Who prepares for the future? These are the teachers. These are the school systems. And now we have 662 educators of color and educational scholars of color across the U.S. They're calling for the retreat from the market-based initiatives like the so-called portfolio model, extension of choice, and deprofessionalizing of teaching itself, being fostered by billionaires upon poor communities of color. These 662 educators are saying that the public is being misled. Billionaires and philanthropists are increasingly placing so-called quote-unquote reform initiatives upon the schools that teach predominantly students of color and low-income students and are using black and brown voices to echo claims of improving schools or advancing civil rights in order to rally community support. The educator who is leading this campaign is Professor Kevin Kamashiro. Welcome, Professor Kevin Kamashiro. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. Professor Kamashiro is an internationally recognized expert on educational policy, school reform, teachers' preparation, and educational equity and social justice. He is former Dean of a School of Education at the University of San Francisco and is the award-winning author and editor of 10 books, including Against Common Sense, Teaching and Learning Towards Social Justice, and Bad Teacher, How Blaming Teachers Distort the Bigger Picture. He has recently authored an article amplifying the voices of 662 educationists entitled Corona Capitalism and the Radicalized Looting of Public Schools. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
I'm really excited to be joining you in conversation today. Thanks for having me.
Well, Professor, what surprises me is that you are pretty bipartisan, equal opportunity critic when it comes to education.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I've been writing about and studying recently is how the reforms that are underway right now that are really dismantling and weakening public schools come from both political parties. Republicans and Democrats in some key ways seem to be agreeing on what we should be doing. And I think the research is clear that these reforms are not working.
So what surprised me was that, this your article of the looting of public school is right at the first paragraph, and you refer to Ernie Duncans, the tall Chicagoan from Hyde Park who used to play basketball with President Obama before he was a president. And I must admit, I have multiple dinners with him when he was the leader of the Chicago public school system. And you say he's the one who relied on a disaster in Louisiana and jumped on reforming, which essentially gutted the whole public school system there. And it is the same thing which our sitting Vice President Mike Pence is saying. So America, in the partisan conflict, welcomes everything which is bipartisan, and here you are criticizing it. So tell me why this coincidence that liberals and conservative and Democrats and Republican agree to something? There must be a disaster they're trying to reform.
Yeah, so the article you mentioned about corona capitalism and the racialized looting of public schools is about what's happening now with the coronavirus pandemic. But I begin that article talking about what happened 15 years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And really briefly, what happened there was that before the floodwaters had even receded from the city of New Orleans, from Hurricane Katrina, the Republican Study Committee, which is the very conservative caucus of Congress, was meeting to talk about how to respond to the hurricane in ways that advanced what they called pro-free market reforms, which is, about kind of marketizing and privatizing the system. And one of the sectors that they wanted to target was education. And indeed, within the next few months, we saw the first federal school voucher program being launched in New Orleans. We also saw the state take over the schools, and almost every school within the next few years became a charter school that kind of fueled the privatization of that school district. And the results, some want to say, Arne Duncan, the reason I bring up Arne Duncan is because he's known a few years later for saying that this is, quote, the best thing that happened to New Orleans was Hurricane Katrina because it allowed them to start over and charterize the district. But the reality is that achievement actually in some ways went better and in some ways didn't. And what we also know is that it exacerbated racial segregation in those schools, much teacher turnover, much kind of community separation, and it fueled kind of profiteering off of public schools. And I bring that up as a model for what's happening today, because the two big kind of conditions that we saw in New Orleans then is the same here. It's massive school closures, which is what we're seeing throughout the country now, and a lot of federal funding. So the same things happening in New Orleans, happening today, but at a much bigger scale. And I think we should therefore be looking at what were people trying to accomplish back then. Both Democrats and Republicans celebrated it, and how is that being repeated right now?
So I understand the Republican going for it, because Republicans, everything private is good and everything public is bad. And if they have a subcommittee of politicians working on it, it may or may not be informed by direct input from educationist or education expert. It may be a dictate of an ideology of conservatism, using the Republican Party tool to implement that. How Democrats, who ideologically may not be on the same positioning, came to the same conclusion?
Yeah, I'm appreciating the question, because for me, this is where history has been very informative for my understanding of what's happening in education. Because I think what's fueling the ideology that drives so much of school reform right now is one that has emerged in this country over the last, say, 70 years, and it's neoliberalism. It's this notion that if you can make everything compete with one another, that's going to drive improvement. So making a system, whether it's like the healthcare system, the economy, the educational system, look like a free marketplace, that's actually going to drive improvement. And so we saw this philosophy inform like international economic policy back in the 50s and 60s. We saw it even drive education policy around the world in the 70s and 80s, particularly in Latin America, where some of the countries with the highest literacy rates marketized their systems. And then you saw a huge kind of shift in the quality of the educational system, so that literacy rates plummeted within just a matter of years. Marketizing systems don't always lead to improvement. And in education, there's lots of evidence that says that doesn't work. What you actually need to do is try to raise the quality of education for everyone. So the problem with a competition, right, is that it presumes or it requires that there be some winners and some losers. And why would we create a system where we're expecting some to lose? This is sort of the fundamental problem of
Wow,
neoliberalism within education.
that's amazing point there. Why would create a system in which you assume that some people must lose?
We want to create a system where everyone can walk to their neighborhood public school and receive the very best education that our nation has to offer. And I think we're moving farther and farther away from that so long as we think of education as a commodity. And this is increasingly how we think about education, that if you have the resources, you should be able to buy a better education. That's not the right philosophy for how we should think about education in a democracy.
When was the ideal time of public education in American history?
Yeah, so this is, I think, another interesting use of history for us, because I think we sometimes like to think that, oh, things were better back then, or we look for this golden age of education. And this was the rhetoric, by the way, particularly as the conservative revolution picked up, that people were saying all these kind of fads from the so-called fads from the civil rights era was weakening public schools. Well, the reality is that public schools in this country, while we talk about providing equal educational opportunity and providing everyone, the opportunity to succeed and leveling the playing field, the reality is that while that might sound like lofty purposes, the function was always quite different. We created the earliest public schools in this country for only the most elite. They were for kids in white families who owned property and they were male. And as we were forced to integrate more and more students, we just came up with more and more ways to divide and sort them, such as through exclusion or segregation or tracking or labeling or discipline. In other words, the purpose we might say is about providing equal educational opportunity and serving all. But the function historically has been to sort. It's why many people will say that the so-called achievement gap, the difference between some students and other students, is a sign that schools are failing. We often say it's a sign that schools are failing, but if you look historically at how we set up schools, the achievement gap is actually a sign that schools are succeeding. They're accomplishing exactly what they were set up to accomplish, which is to sort and socialize, right? So our job isn't to look back at some mythical past when things were great, because the reality is that schools were always this contested terrain. Our job is to dive into the contradiction that we want schools to serve a function for which it was never created in the first place.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Kevin. And he is leading 660, he has led 662 educators to sign on to better public educational system. One of the concern, one of the things which I hear you saying, correct me if I heard you wrong, that what was the Republican-led ideology essentially have taken Democrats and liberals along with it. So there is no powerful movement in the political arena which emphasizes the public education and equal opportunity for all. So we don't have anybody left behind. With left behind comes to another reform in my mind, though. So where is the campaign? Where is the movement?
Yeah, when we recognize, I think about back in the 1980s, this kind of neoliberal ideology, this notion that markets will solve all of our problems, became so commonplace in DC. It had a name. It was called the Washington Consensus. It's where Republicans and Democrats seem to believe that if you treat things like a marketplace, it's going to improve everything. And so that is the big challenge now, is where is kind of the progressive voice that pushes back against this ideology? And I think, interestingly, this is a moment now where there are more and more folks And people have always spoken up against kind of the dominant trends to quote unquote reform schools. But I think in this particular moment, there seems to be, with a lot of kind of public uprisings, maybe especially over the last 10 years around, you saw a lot more teacher strikes happening. You saw parents organizing against high stakes testing. You saw students walking out around safety. There's a lot more kind of mass mobilizing that's happening that says we want to push back against the dominant frames, the dominant messages, that the rhetoric, the stories that we're all buying into, that this is the only way to go. Like Democrats and Republicans seem to be buying into the story that testing tells us everything we need to know. So No Child Left Behind, but also Race to the Top, relied so heavily on testing that it ballooned the testing industry. It created this amazing opportunity to profiteer off of testing. Same with technology. As we close schools right now because of the COVID pandemic, there's massive profits to be made if you technologize, overly rely on technology to solve all of our problems. We should be insisting not that we double down on how schools have always looked, but that we radically reimagine. And I think a lot of the organizing that's happening right now is about trying to radically reimagine what schools can and should look like.
Thank you so much. So we're talking with Professor Kevin Kumashiro, and this is Imam Malik Mujahid. You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as muslimnetwork.tv. We'll be right back after these messages.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Bika from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
It's Adam's World. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah. Let's explore.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Kevin Kumashiro. One of the things, Professor, I did preparing for the show this morning was to Google. I checked the Google News about teachers with the keyword. Then I checked it with public schooling. I also checked public school reform. And to my surprise, with each one of those searches, I got just one article among the tons of articles which showed up. News item, that is. One was about, teachers pointing out how few Black male teachers are there. I think only 2%, and we'll come to it. Another article was about the World Socialist website talking about the education reform. And when I checked for the public school reforms from any side of the debate, there was just one article, is Stanford Social Innovation Review, and that was it. So there seems to be hardly any attention to public schooling reform. It's not part of the debate. Elections are coming up. The parties will be fighting. A politician will be willing here and there to talk to people through Zoom, probably. And so where is the debate? Where is the movement? How long it took you to get 662 people to sign up on it? So I'm concerned that you are making a very logical and bold statement. You're talking about a scandal. You're talking about people taken for a ride in the name of reform, and Democrats and Republicans both are involved. But there are those radical voices seems to be out of anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why a bunch of us decided to create this letter. So this statement that you're talking about, signed by so far 662, it's educators of color and educational scholars of color throughout the United States who are coming together to push back on the reforms that are being foisted upon poorer Black and brown communities throughout the country by billionaires. And so this is one of the reasons that we wrote this letter, is that the coverage that does seem to go to education seems to focus on this high profile, very wealthy white men who tend to be driving a lot of educational reform. So two quick examples. Recently, in the last few weeks, you saw the governor of New York create a task force that is about reimagining or revisioning public schools in New York. And who does he appoint? He appoints billionaires, including Bill Gates, who has long been involved in education, but his reforms have been very destructive to the poorest communities in our country. And most recently, just within the last week, who gets a lot of attention is Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, who gave over $100 million to historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, even though in California, Hastings has really championed the disenfranchisement of communities of color from governance by moving away from elected school boards, and the proliferation of charter schools, which, as you mentioned, there's kind of a scandal going on with charter schools that are they're raking in tens of millions of dollars that were meant for small businesses, hundreds of millions of dollars that were meant for neighborhood public schools within the stimulus packages that we saw for COVID, not to mention the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been documented going to charter schools that either closed within a short period after starting up or never really opened. And so there's a lot of money that's influencing education right now that seems to drive our attention without asking, well, what's actually behind all of these reforms, and what actually is going on? And so the letter that we're trying to sort of get out there in the media is saying, actually, there seems to be a consensus among the billionaires about how to reform education. And so the statement tries to point to three major types of reforms that they're pushing for. And the expansion of choice and vouchers and charter schools and privatizing schools is one. The deprofessionalizing of teaching is another. But the big one that encapsulates everything is called the portfolio model, which is really about marketizing schools. And we're trying to say, actually, the evidence is really clear. These reforms are making things worse for our poorest Black and brown communities. These must end. The title of this statement is "This Must End Now." And we're hoping that a lot more people, not just the 600 so that have signed on, but that a lot more communities speak up and push back against the voices that seem to dominate the media right now in terms of what should happen in schools.
So, Iskandar, you mentioned that a lot of money went into, and those charter schools never opened up. So scandals could be associated with the, with the public school system. There's a lot of corruption which happens in all institutions as well as charter system. Are there studies who have studied in a little bit following the subjective or objective methodologies of research to look at performances and benefits and harm it's bring to the area charter school opens up? Is it thoroughly studied topic, or people are picking cherries here and there?
Yeah, there's such a range of studies, and part of the issue, what makes it complicated, is that different studies look at different aspects or different impacts of charter schools. And so for example, we know that in the 80s, but especially 90s, when the whole charter school movement first started, a lot of grassroots organizations, not just the privatizers. So it was sort of strange bedfellows. You had the privatizers, but you also had grassroots organizations that were saying charter schools is a way to democratize education because neighborhood public schools are failing for a lot of students. We need to create these alternatives. And look in Hawaii as a great example of where a lot of sort of indigenous kind of culture and language is being revitalized in some of the charter schools, as a alternative to the neighborhood public schools. So there are pluses. And the research shows that some schools work, it's just like neighborhood public schools. Some schools work well and some schools don't. So I'm less concerned about the outliers, and I'm less concerned about this back and forth between, does this school work better than that school? What I'm actually a lot more concerned about is, what does it do to the system? Right? I want to know what actually builds the capacity of the public school system to improve education. And when you charterize a district, is it more likely to leave schools behind? One of the reasons that some charter schools perform better is they don't have to take and serve the wide diversity of students that neighborhood public schools need to serve. You don't necessarily have to take students with disabilities, students who are English language learners, students who are homeless, students who are poor, and so on and so forth, right? Whereas neighborhood public schools are required by law to do so. And so our job, I think, isn't to fracture the system. Our job is to figure out, how do we improve the system to insist that it serve especially those who are most disadvantaged and disenfranchised from public schools. And so that's the type of questions that I'm more interested in. But yeah, as you point out, I think there's a range of research. And part of the issue here, the complexity, is that they are asking very different kinds of questions, all very important, but very varied. And that's what makes our understanding of the charter school movement so difficult to sort of grasp.
Well, thank you so much. So thoughtful responses from you. And so can we expect the next letter signed by 1,000 teachers or educationists will be focused on what reform public school system should have to address the issues which already exist?
Yeah,
because right now, the people are talking about criminal justice system reform and a police reform. Discussion and debate about reform is to the level that even Republicans chose the only Black senator they have to present that they are looking for some reform in policing as well. But the racial justice is not limited to when you're killing somebody. It starts way before. Why, what is the mindset that person has who is killing? What makes a person who is about to be killed to get the images of other killing and try to run away to save his life, only to be shot dead again, as it happened in Atlanta? I mean, the personal. So education and the cultural mindset is so critical for our future, for any criminal justice or any police reform to survive. So if it's so critical, so instead of just challenging, I mean, each thing has its space. So can we expect, while the America is talking about reform, so the people who are critical of the reform on which, isn't this amazing that Gates Foundation and Koch Foundation both agree on something which you are opposing, and Republican and Democrats? So when people are talking reform, what about inserting, okay, these are the 1, 2, 10 things which we are looking for public school system itself to address what you are worried about? Because, I have lived 40 years in the US, all in the Black community or mixed communities. And I know the public school, which will be just 2-3 blocks south of me, will hardly have any capacity to have proper labs and proper things in place, and they're struggling for everything. And 2-3 block north of my place will be a school which will be better funded because of the whole model of that it is the property tax which is going to be assigned to the educational, to that particular school. So poor schooling, people's school will always be poor because there's most property are down already. Our property values are low. So are there, reforms which could be pushed when people are talking to politicians on Zoom town hall and whatnot, and people who are interested? I mean, I know Democratic Party has the Pacific Asian caucus. Democratic Party have a Muslim caucus. Democratic Party has multiple caucuses. I mean, it's a party which calls itself an umbrella of multiple other umbrellas, I guess. So there is an opportunity to push this reform. And of course, the blacks who turned the election from Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden have substantial amount of power. I mean, cannot be imagined that a Democratic Party can do anything unless the blacks mobilize and enthusiastic about mobilizing for it, and they have power. How come? And they are the one who, along with Latinos and some others, not as much as Asian Americans, are directly impacted by can benefit from the public schooling, and some of them are going for charter school and all that. So can there be a set of reform on which a larger body of education it sign on, which could be pushed further?
Yeah, I love that idea of finding a platform that many different sectors can join. I mean, we did put some recommendations in our statement, and I know that Bernie Sanders' campaign put forward the Thurgood Marshall Plan. Black Lives Matter has a proposal, and there's a Student Bill of Rights out there that has been a campaign for years. So there are these great platforms that we need to mobilize around. And one of the things I think about is how any platform, as you're pointing out, should be beyond just that institution. Like with policing, I think about the call for abolition of policing, abolition of prisons. And I love the argument that abolition isn't just about closing the institution. We're not just about closing prisons or closing policing, because if the mindset is still that punishment and policing is the solution, then you're simply going to come up with a different instrument to accomplish that. So the wonderful scholar Ruth Wilson argues that abolition is actually about changing the social conditions that make prisons and policing into the solution. Right? It's about changing all sorts of things. So when we think about education as well, it's not just about tinkering with one policy or another. It's about actually looking at all the different institutions that intersect with schooling, like funding, and like neighborhood segregation, and like disenfranchisement from governance, and like sort of the profiteering through high stakes testing. And it's all these things that intersect, right? It's not just the school itself. And the final thing I would say on this topic is that I think, as you're pointing out, our big challenge isn't to simply come up with a policy that's going to change how all the problems that we face. Our challenge is actually to raise the public consciousness about the larger issues at stake, right? Education in a democracy shouldn't be about conforming the ways that we think, getting everyone to buy into the dominant stories. Education for democracy is about getting people to question the dominant stories and sort of ask themselves and inquire how things can be better. It's about imagining and creating a different world. And I think that's the kind of education we want to see, but it's also the education that we need before we can even see those possibilities.
Thank you so much. We're talking with Professor Kevin Comashero. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. This is the only television Muslim Americans have. We are on Galaxy 19 satellite. We're also on Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and you can always watch us on our YouTube channel or our own website. We are streaming live right now, which is muslimnetwork.tv. We'll be right back after these messages.
We are Justice for All. Headquartered in the heart of downtown Chicago, Justice for All is a global humanitarian initiative dedicated to raising awareness for human rights concerns impacting vulnerable minority groups. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and recognize the plight of refugees and forced migrants. Our diverse team of staff and volunteers, led by Imam Malik Mujahid, work tirelessly to help Justice for All achieve their goals. Past campaigns covered a wide range of humanitarian concerns. Through Bosnia Task Force, imams and leaders of Chicago's Muslim community worked to ensure Bosnia became a top national issue. This led to life-saving American policies in Bosnia. A key accomplishment was helping to get rape declared a war crime. Initiatives also included Kosovo Task Force, Central African Republic Task Force, and Flint Coalition, which brought awareness to the water crisis affecting the people of Flint, Michigan. Highlights of our work include supporting Black Lives Matter, Parliament of the World's Religions, addressing climate change.
So wasteful consumption starts the ruthless production, and that's where we need all the fossil fuel in the world.
And prominent media exposure.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, President of Justice for All.
And I'm the Director of Outreach for Justice for All.
And that's why we need to go back to what worked.
Today we're demanding an apology from the CEO of Costco.
The Chinese crackdown on Uyghurs and other Turkic people has only gotten worse.
Current programs such as Burma Task Force advocate for the rights of Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, internally displaced populations, and all those denied freedom of movement and at risk of starvation. Through this, we mobilized thousands of calls to elected representatives. This paved the way for the U.S. to increase funding for Rohingya refugees from $30 million to over $600 million. Two of our documentaries were featured on international news outlets. The Rohingya People, a slow-burning genocide, on BBC World News, and Rohingya Refugees Tel Aviv Massacre was featured on CNN. We've organized rallies, UN mission visits, expanded presentations on campuses, promoted research and report writing, outreach to think tanks, media, and other influencers. Faith Coalition educates about the Rohingya genocide and crimes against humanity faced by ethnic groups in Burma. We've traveled to refugee camps, convened a meeting of Karen, Kachin, and Rohingya leaders, both to encourage cooperation and to guide them in congressional outreach. We organized Rohingya Advocacy Day. This led to over 100 participants visiting the offices of 60 U.S. senators and congressional representatives. Free Kashmir advocates for the people of Kashmir. Long-term goals include the call for self-determination, the end of the Indian military's occupation of the territory, and raising awareness of Kashmiri issues among the American people. After the August 5th reinvasion of Kashmir, we organized national protests in front of various Indian government buildings, partnered with Stand With Kashmir, and launched a petition condemning the Gates Foundation's decision to present Prime Minister Modi a humanitarian award. Save Uyghur informs Muslims and neighbors of other faiths about the ongoing cultural genocide of Uyghur Muslims and mobilizes public support. Our projects include boycotting Chinese products with our Fast From China campaign, pushing Bill S-178 in the Senate, and organizing a nationwide protest of Costco. Together, we can continue to stand up for justice. Justice for all.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. And we're discussing public education for the whole country. And I will present here a challenge Muslim community in America faced. Muslim community is pretty diverse. It's about 25-30% African Americans. You will have about 30% South Asian, 20% Arabs and Latinos and whites. It's one of the most diverse community. And 9/11 has made it more of a community instead of dividing ethnically. It came together. After 9/11, there was a lot of pressure on children, especially on Muslim children in school. And so the community, seeing the pressure children are facing, went into multiple directions to try to handle. There used to be not more than 30-40 public schools before that. Muslim day school, full-time Muslim schools. Now there are about 400 of those. Right in Chicago, there are close to 30. So one direction when we're going to establish our schools so our kids don't have to face bullying and nonsense. And 25% of people who are bullying were actually public school teachers themselves. And so people didn't know how to confront whenever they go. I personally have experience of what my children went through, and I have very difficult hearing. Even those schools my children were going were led by people of color, and they have difficulty understanding and all that. So another direction people went was homeschooling. Homeschooling became very popular, only to find out the leaders of homeschooling were all Christian evangelicals who were coining their books and turning everybody to love Jesus, while without they knowing that Muslim already love Jesus. We believe in Jesus. So the third direction which people went was the Ernie Duncan's direction. I used to have at least 2 or 3 dinners with him, of course, meeting in other public places where mayor is there and all that, but we will have Muslim community educationist leadership meeting with him, and he will tell me very clearly that, get me a good principal, how many public charter schools you want, I will sanction them. And through him, I found out one of the best run charter school was a school run by Muslim. It was considered the best math and science school in the whole Illinois. And so one direction went, okay, let's benefit from the charter school and that funding. So community was very directly thinking of its own interest, what's happening to my children, how I provide an environment in which my children can learn and thrive. And of course, there were some desire also that I want my children to learn about their faith and their culture, and those desires are also there. So I'm depicting to you a community which somewhat benefited from public schooling system, but became a concern. I still believe, I don't have any statistics or survey, but I believe it's still 95% of all Muslim children go to public schools. They should have primary interest focusing on public school system and those Islamophobic teachers to be improved and all that. And that used to be another topic which we used to talk, Ernie Duncans, when he was chief of Chicago public school system. So in that particular environment and giving this particular case, how would you advise? Consider yourself a consultant for Muslim community right now. What will be your advice for us?
Yeah, I think the reality is that public schools do not work for many children and communities. And it's not surprising that there will be a lot who will be seeking other opportunities, and they should have the right and the ability and the capacity to do so. So I'm going to give a 2-part answer. One is that parents, communities, and children need schools that work for them. And we all need the ability to be able to find and create schools that work, right? And so these kinds of options are incredibly important. But at the same time, what I would say is, as we advocate for our own, whether it's through like the creation of a different school, charter or private or otherwise, we also should be advocating to improve the system, because there are many children and families and communities who will not be able to take advantage, who don't have those options, who aren't nearby or don't have the resources to be able to attend a separate school. And our job is to hold accountable the public school system to serve everyone. I mean, I think that to me is the bottom line, is let's hold our public school systems accountable to serve every child in our neighborhoods and in our country, and let's demand that they continue to get better. I don't want to see some students have the ability to go to a school that serves them and others get left behind. That is not, to me, an okay solution. An okay solution is to say, temporarily, I'm going to do what's in the best interest of my child, whatever that means, but I'm also going to fight for every other child in our school system. And I think that's why many want to take this two-pronged approach, which is, yes, if you want to, just like I was talking about in Hawaii with the schools for Native Hawaiian students, or for sort of revitalization of Native Hawaiian language and culture. Those are incredibly important interventions, but they're not actually the only thing we need to be doing. We need to be saying schools in Hawaii need to serve everybody. And in fact, even if you're not Native Hawaiian, you need to be in a school where there are Native Hawaiian teachers and where you're learning about sort of cultural and language revitalization, because that kind of sort of diverse curriculum prepares us all to succeed in the world, in a very diverse world. So let's hold our schools accountable to serve everyone. I think that would be one of my big calls to action to any community who's looking to advocate for their own.
So this is an extraordinary position which you have, that people should have choices, people should have options available, what suits for their children. But we cannot save our children by ignoring all other children. So a common good public education system, which should have reforms of its own, but not at the risk of abandoning that. And that's where I like to share a scandal with you. The best possible Illinois school, a friend of mine, a Latino, who deals with organizing people, workers who are works for a labor union in Chicago, for which I raise funds and everything. He approached me that charter school is not allowing, number one, teachers to be properly paid or organized for that. Number two, they're forcing those teachers to contribute, I think if I remember correctly, 10% of income back to the not-for-profit which was running the charter school. And I have, so I knew both sides of it. One side, Ernie Duncan was appreciating how good it is. On the other side, I'm learning how horrible it was for the teacher's experience, to add to the point which you have. Now tell me, you as an Asian American are leading this particular effort, preaching against the oppressive education and preaching for the good public schooling for all available, without denying options to other people who want to go for it, but not taking away the public money for private personal good. I remember a little oppressive education of mine, and how in the elementary school in Asia, little kids in elementary school will be physically beaten up. I remember one kid whose name actually will translate as Lion of the Skies. He peed in his pants while I was watching, because of that oppressive style of education. So when you became a leader of the crusade against oppressive education, is there some oppressive education from the Asian background I detect here?
Yeah, I mean, such a great point, right? That even some of the school systems around the world that we hold up as models for, because of their high achievement, are very problematic in other ways, right? There's pros and cons to so many different school systems. So our job isn't to find that magic bullet. Our job is to actually is to do the research, the hard work of asking what does it mean to build a school system that serves a democracy. And I think, speaking of Asians in the US in this moment, I do think that the coronavirus pandemic provides this amazing opportunity for us to really think about the role of kind of anti-Asian racism in this moment, right? It's anti-Asian racism proliferated around the country. It just massively spread and was increased when the coronavirus happened, because all this sort of anti-Chinese sort of rhetoric was happening. And there's two quick things that I would say about this. One is that we have in this country a long history of equating Asianness with disease, right? For 200 years, we can look back in history and find moments in history where we blamed particularly Chinese, but not always Chinese, sometimes other groups as well, for bringing and spreading all kinds of diseases in this country, like bubonic plague and cholera and syphilis and trachoma and stuff like that. And now COVID. And this relates to the second point, which is that in each of these moments in time, there was a political reason why this kind of racializing of disease emerged. In other words, there was a larger reason why we wanted to demonize China. Maybe it was because we wanted to end immigration, or maybe because we wanted to fuel segregation, which both of those were actually sort of things happening in history at the times of the emergence of this kind of labor restrictions, preventing unionizing, all of this kind of stuff. So what's happening right now in this moment is that we have a presidential election coming up, and we actually heard both of the major candidates, Trump and Biden, actually use anti-China rhetoric in their talking about this moment. And I think one of the things we want to ask is, well, why is anti-China rhetoric so important? Well, it has a lot to do with red baiting and anti-communism that has actually also helped us to understand why the progressive movement in this country has retreated so many times over the last sort of 70 years or so, right? So I think if look at even how the Democrats treated Bernie Sanders. I mean, one of the attacks was around kind of communist baiting and sort of using that rhetoric to make people afraid of this candidate. I think that's what we should be asking is, when stereotypes and negative portrayals emerge about any group, but in this case about Asians, what is the political reason why that might be happening? I mean, I think that helps us to understand the context that we find ourselves in and what it is that we need to mobilize against.
Professor Kamashiro, one of the thing comes to my mind as a positive. I see these young people marching. I mean, I went to a march. Of course, being an older person, I remain in my car because it was a car caravan in the first march which took place. And I see these young people. I mean, there were hardly anybody of my age group. They were these young people. And they were all color schemes of God Almighty, black and brown and yellow and white and all the shades in between. So did public schooling create these new kids that in some areas there are, blacks who are not willing to sit down and behave, whites who are not willing to sit down and behave? Have we created enough rebels through public schooling? Should we take some credit for what is happening in the country right now?
I think absolutely there's a consciousness raising that is happening among this newest generation that colors and permeates the organizing that's happening around the country. And one of the very specific things that I think is very clear in the youth organizing happening, whether it's Black Lives Matter around race, whether it's Sunrise Movement around climate change, whether it's kind of now the sort of latest uprisings around state violence and sort of lynching around Black people, but also around gun violence in schools. All of these movements that youth are leading are very intersectional, right? They're not only looking at multiple dimensions of diversity, they're looking at multiple institutions and how they all come together to to sort of fuel the problems or reinforce the problems that we're trying to challenge. And I think that's an exciting moment that, part of it might be through the school system. Part of it, though, I think is through the community organizations and the legacies that we have of organizing that we can attribute to generations that have been trying to do this work. There's so many different shoulders that we're standing on to do this work and to bring us to this moment when we can question the rhetoric that even our community, even sort of the past organizing has led us to think are the only ways forward. They're radically reimagining and pushing forward new visions, and I find that very exciting and promising.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I mean, you're such a thoughtful guest. Are you looking for a job or something? Tell me, one of the leaving the bigger discussion about reform. I mean, right now we're all stuck at home. Children are stuck at home. A couple of months of schooling was when school were closed, and parents didn't have enough computers. I mean, most parents, most homes are not equipped for one computer per person. Some rich people were able to probably buy, but a majority of the people, I don't think, were capable, and they were struggling with that. And teachers didn't know how to teach online, so what suggestions do you have? Because it looks like the fall classes are going to be subjected to the same issues which we faced just in the last couple of months. So what people should do now in summer to ensure that the largest number of public school students get proper education? I mean, we're looking at a loss of a nation.
Yeah, I mean, I would say 3 quick things. One is that this is a moment when there's potentially over $100 billion being diverted from the federal government through stimulus aid that could massively go to the profits of tech companies. So we should be wary of relying on technology to solve all of our problems and to fuel profiteering. My second point is that, as you're already pointing out, there's so much existing inequities that actually get exacerbated, like the difference in resources between schools or even between homes or the capacity of teachers and students. I think the first thing we should be doing is not trying to insist that we stay the course and stay on pace and just replicate everything that schools normally do, but online. That's not the solution. The solution is actually to forefront where are the inequities and tackle the inequities first so that the people who are already being left behind don't get left behind even more. And then really briefly, my last point on this is, I think schools, where we went wrong in the last few months is we doubled down on delivering content and practicing that content, right? We did the most simplistic, narrow ways of thinking about education when we know that students were being traumatized. We also know that it's the soft skills like social interaction, social skills, work habits, conscientiousness, consciousness. All of those things get lost when we narrowly use technology to force students to simply absorb content and practice. We actually need to be developing their fuller selves in order to thrive in this moment. And I think that sort of dehumanizing of children is one of the worst, I think, atrocities that has happened in this moment. And if all we do is focus narrowly on sort of content, we lose our ability to nurture children in a moment when they most need to be nurtured. And so those are some of the kind of reframings that I would urge us to think about in this moment of as we look to the fall.
Professor Kevin Kamashiro, thank you so much. I know that researching to talk to you, I looked into and I realized you're master of saying big things in a short amount of period of time. So tell me in 1 minute, which I have, why everybody should be behind public schooling system and public schooling reforms.
Yeah. If we were in a very oppressive, totalitarian country, you would imagine that schools would be simply getting you to buy into the official narratives. It would be about brainwashing and conformity and assimilation. And so we'd create weak school systems for the masses and elite school systems for the rich, which is actually what it looks like here. And so that's why I think it's important for us to ask, well, in a country where we claim to be all about democracy, what would a school system look like that actually fuels democracy, not simply assimilation? And I think our answer is going to be that schools need to look different. We need to heavily invest in schools as a human right and a public good. And it needs to be about preparing kids to imagine a very different world and build their capacity to create that world in their lifetime. And so that's why I think schools are so important for our future, especially in democracy. And that's why we all need to get behind social movements to reclaim education in schools and build that vision today.
Thank you so much, Professor Kevin Kumashiro. Thank you for getting 662 educationists to agree with the movement to strengthen public school system. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you have been watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and our own website, muslimnetwork.tv. Thank you, Zahra Nadeem, for producing our show today. And thank you, our intern producer, Sumaya Haider, for your contributions. Thank you. Peace. Salam.